castigos, lo que causa mucho problema, mucha destrucción. La codependencia, que es parte de la adicción, es relacional. Hay dos personas muchas veces cuando hay premios y castigos, por lo menos dos o más. El problema cuando es sistémico, la solución es la resistencia a la situación. Pero esa resistencia, para empezarlo, hay que tener la comunicación primero. Y hay que saber cuál es el problema. Hay que identificar el problema. Y después hay que comunicarse con el oponente, con el enemigo. Hay que comunicarse y esa parte puede ser bien difícil, especialmente si es, oh, I'm speaking in Spanish by mistake. All this has been a waste. I have to start over again. Good afternoon. I'll start over again. Today, we are starting to talk about rewards and punishments in groups, not just for children, not just one-to-one also, but groups. It becomes much more, I suppose it becomes much more complicated when there are groups than when it's a simple example. The way to look at addiction is that they call it codependence. I think that refers to the fact that usually there are always more than one person rewarding or punishing. That's how it starts. There's usually more than one person involved. So it's codependence. One person might be looking for one thing, and the other person, he's giving the reward for the other person what they're looking for, or something like that. If you have a problem within a system, the way to address it, if you have a problem caused by this system, which is great injustice, the way to solve it is through resistance. It should, of course, be nonviolent, or you will be continuing the addiction, which is the problem. So it should be nonviolent resistance, because you don't want to punish anyone. And to get to that point, you can't just start by nonviolent resistance. First of all, you have to go through a process. And first of all, you have to identify what the problem is. Then you have to communicate with your opponent. And this can be very difficult, because sometimes the opponent might not even speak the same language you speak or understand what you're talking about. Sometimes they won't even talk to you. Sometimes they're so high above you that you can't even get an appointment to talk with them. But the first step, when you have a group of people backing you up, the first step is to try to communicate. And maybe it was just a mistake. Maybe your opponent didn't realize the harm they were doing, and it could be solved just by that communication. And that should be started first. Then after that, if you find it totally impossible to communicate, then it's time for the nonviolent resistance, which, if done the right way, with care, always with care of the opponent, this resistance can possibly improve the situation. This is not a scientific thing. It is not something that's proven. This is a type of knowledge which is evolutionary, where the people evolve from what they were to what they hopefully can become on both sides, the opponent and you. You start to learn more about the opponent, they start to learn more about you, and the whole situation hopefully will improve. And as the resistance goes on, the ones that are resisting should be very aware of their opponent. And if they are doing damage by their resistance, then they should be aware of that and they shouldn't do damage. They should try not to hurt the opponent, but they are trying to resist what the opponent is doing to them without hurting the opponent. And it's a lot of work to try to do something like this. And Gandhi, when he was doing this, one time he stopped in the middle of his resistance. He said, we're not going to do that anymore because the opponent is getting hurt. He saw that they were hurting the opponent. They didn't want to do that. That was not their intention. And he actually stopped the whole program of resistance that they were doing. An example of this systemic rewards and punishment is in Congress, when a senator might make some kind of a deal, this artificial rewards and punishment, the wrong kind of deal, where he gets what he wants and the other senator gets what they want, but when it's not for the common good of the whole country, it's just for their own interests, and they both get their interests through some legislation that they make a deal on and they get passed somehow. But when it's not for the good of the whole country, maybe they would have to have more than just two of them make the legislation to make sure that they get everybody happy. But if it's not for the common good of the whole country, then that would be an example of the bad results, the addiction results of this rewards and punishment, where each one of them is addicted to something, and the way you can tell is when it's not for the common good. That's when you know there's something wrong. A common addiction is to economic growth, and the excessive use of fossil fuels has been part of this addiction. There's an addiction it leads to an addiction to fossil fuels, which helps economic growth. And then that causes an imbalance, and the whole country is hurt by this imbalance. The atmosphere is hurt. We have global warming and so on. This addiction is a process that keeps going and affecting a lot of different things. Another example of a bad use of this artificial rewards and punishments is when the government, instead of equally giving out funding, they give it just to one thing or one place. For example, if somehow the federal government or the president would give money to a state which does what he likes and doesn't give the money to another state, this is an example of a very destructive use of rewards when it's not given out in an egalitarian way where everyone is treated the same regardless of their politics. That is an example of this rewards and punishment on a systemic level. And another example is in the international world, when rewards and punishments are given out, or when loans are like rewards, and they're given out maybe by the World Bank, but they're given to certain places, and depending upon, they're very manipulative because it depends upon whether those places do what they want. So it's not really for the good of the country. They have to go along with it, and they're being manipulated as to their internal policies according to the loans. Probably it would be better if the World Bank didn't give out any loans hadn't given out any to begin with, because they only manipulate. Those rewards are manipulative. Another example is the Free Trade Agreement, which was passed, NAFTA, which was passed, which favored the international companies that went to Mexico. They were rewarded. If they could move to Mexico, they'd get the cheap labor, they'd get to send their products back and not have any taxes put on the products. Various different favors were done for them at the expense, and it wasn't done for companies that stayed in the United States, smaller companies that didn't get all those benefits. That's another example of the harm of rewards and punishments, rewarding certain companies, not rewarding other companies, and in other words, it's unjust, and it causes divisions between those companies. It isn't fair because they might have to compete against each other, and one is getting all these favoritism. And it's manipulative because that's what the people wanted them to do. They wanted them to start, somebody on top wanted it to happen, and it was manipulating these companies to do what whoever wanted it to happen. Maybe it was the companies themselves, the big companies, the corporations. Okay, I'll continue with this tomorrow. Thank you.